I was sitting in the boardroom of Midwest Manufacturing Solutions, my laptop open to the final slide of what I thought would be a career-defining presentation. The numbers glowing on the conference room's massive screen told an incredible story. We had reduced operational costs by 18% while maintaining every quality standard that mattered. After 6 years of working my way up from junior analyst to chief financial analyst, this moment felt like validation of everything I had learned about sustainable business practices. The mahogany conference table was surrounded by nodding heads and approving murmurs. Board members were genuinely impressed with the comprehensive quarterly financial review I had just delivered. Chairman Robert Hayes leaned back in his leather chair and smiled warmly. "Excellent work, Jennifer. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need moving forward." The words felt like sunshine after months of increasingly tense budget meetings and uncomfortable conversations about cost-cutting measures. But what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about corporate loyalty, professional integrity, and the price of speaking truth to power. As I reached to close my laptop, feeling proud and accomplished, our new CEO, Michael Patterson, stood up from the back of the room where he had been sitting quietly throughout my presentation. The look on his face should have warned me that my moment of triumph was about to become something else entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you! My name is Jennifer Martinez, and 6 months ago I was fired for doing exactly what any responsible financial professional should do: asking hard questions about budget cuts that could put people at risk. Today, I'm the CEO of that same company, and the audit results that led to my vindication shocked everyone, including me. This is the story of how questioning dangerous cost-cutting measures cost me my job, but ultimately revealed a truth that changed everything. I had always been the kind of person who paid attention to details that others might overlook. Growing up in a working-class family in Milwaukee, I learned early that financial decisions weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they affected real people's lives. My father worked in manufacturing for 35 years, coming home with stories about safety shortcuts that put workers at risk and quality compromises that hurt customers. Those dinner table conversations shaped my understanding that responsible financial management meant protecting people, not just maximizing profits. After graduating from Northwestern University with a degree in finance and accounting, I was thrilled to land a position as a junior analyst at Midwest Manufacturing Solutions. The company had a solid reputation in the Chicago area for producing industrial equipment with an emphasis on quality and safety. It seemed like the perfect place to build a career while staying true to the values my father had instilled in me. Those early years were challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. Being a young Latina woman in a predominantly male industry meant proving myself constantly. I worked 70-hour weeks, arrived early, stayed late, and said yes to every project that came my way. While my male colleagues could make mistakes and have them overlooked as learning experiences, I knew that any error I made would be scrutinized and remembered. The pressure was intense, but it taught me to be thorough, methodical, and absolutely certain of my facts before presenting them. Over 6 years, I had built the entire financial forecasting system from scratch, transforming how the company analyzed costs and projected revenues. When the supply chain crisis hit in 2020, I was the one who worked around the clock to restructure vendor relationships and keep us financially stable while competitors struggled. When our CFO left suddenly in 2022, I stepped into his role temporarily, managing both financial analysis and strategic planning until the company could hire a replacement. The work was demanding but rewarding. I had trained 3 junior analysts who looked up to me as a mentor. I had implemented cost-saving measures that saved the company over $2.3 million annually. I had never missed a deadline, never submitted a report with errors, and had built relationships with vendors, auditors, and regulatory officials that benefited the company in countless ways. I wasn't just an employee. I was the institutional memory of every major financial decision made over the past 6 years. That institutional knowledge became crucial during the challenging period when Michael Patterson joined Midwest Manufacturing as our new CEO. The board had recruited him from a prestigious consulting firm in New York, impressed by his track record of quickly increasing profitability at struggling companies. His resume was impressive: MBA from Wharton, experience with Fortune 500 companies, a reputation for turning around underperforming businesses through aggressive cost management. From day one, Michael made it clear that he viewed the company through a different lens than his predecessors. Where our previous leadership had emphasized sustainable growth and long-term stability, Michael focused on quarterly results and shareholder returns. He spoke frequently about right-sizing operations and eliminating inefficiencies in ways that made many of us uncomfortable. The red flags started appearing within his first month. Budget meetings that had previously included department heads and senior analysts suddenly became executive-only affairs. Financial projections that I had always prepared were being developed by an outside consulting firm Michael had brought in. Conversations would stop abruptly when I entered rooms, and I began to sense an undercurrent of change that nobody was discussing openly. The pressure began during our first one-on-one meeting. Michael sat across from me in his newly redecorated office, surrounded by motivational posters about breakthrough thinking and disruptive leadership. He pulled out a thick folder of proposals that made my stomach turn as I read through them. "Jennifer, I need you to understand that we're entering a new phase of operational excellence," he said, using the kind of corporate speak that sounds impressive but means very little. "Your conservative approach has merit, but we need to think bigger about cost reduction opportunities." The proposals were alarming. He wanted to slash safety training budgets by 60%, arguing that modern equipment required less training than older machinery. He proposed eliminating 2 quality control positions, claiming that statistical process control could replace human oversight. Most concerning of all, he wanted to defer equipment maintenance and reduce our insurance coverage to levels that seemed dangerously inadequate. When I raised concerns about these proposals, Michael's demeanor shifted noticeably. His friendly, corporate smile became strained, and his voice took on an edge of impatience. "Jennifer, I appreciate your thoroughness, but sometimes analysis paralysis prevents us from taking necessary action. These cuts are based on industry best practices and proven methodologies." I tried to explain that industry best practices needed to be adapted to our specific operational requirements and regulatory environment. Midwest Manufacturing operated in a highly regulated industry, where safety violations could result in significant penalties and operational shutdowns. Our insurance requirements weren't suggestions. They were legal mandates that protected both our workers and our customers. Michael dismissed my concerns as fear-based thinking and suggested that I was being overly cautious in my approach to financial management. When I provided detailed analysis showing how his proposed cuts could expose the company to regulatory penalties that would far exceed any cost savings, he accused me of being resistant to change and locked into outdated thinking patterns. The breaking point came during a budget meeting 3 weeks before my termination. Michael had invited several department heads to review his cost-cutting proposals, and the room was filled with concerned faces as he outlined his plans. Sarah Chen, our Director of Quality Assurance, raised her hand hesitantly. "Michael, I'm concerned about the impact of eliminating quality control positions on our regulatory compliance," she said carefully. "We're subject to regular inspections, and any lapses in quality documentation could result in significant penalties." Michael's response was swift and dismissive. "Sarah, quality control is evolving beyond traditional oversight models. Statistical process control and automated systems can provide better consistency than human inspection. We need to embrace innovation, not cling to outdated practices." Tom Rodriguez from Safety Training tried a different approach. "I understand the need for cost management, But our safety training programs are specifically designed around OSHA requirements for our industry. A 60% reduction would make it impossible to maintain compliance with federal regulations. Tom, I've reviewed similar operations that have successfully reduced training costs through more efficient delivery methods, Michael replied. We're not eliminating safety, we're optimizing it. I had remained quiet during this exchange, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. Michael, I've run the numbers on regulatory compliance costs, and the potential penalties for safety violations or quality lapses significantly exceed the proposed savings. We could face OSHA fines of up to $400,000, plus the cost of operational shutdowns and remediation. The room went silent. Michael stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not just annoyance, but genuine anger. Jennifer, this is exactly the kind of negativity that prevents organizations from achieving breakthrough results. Every proposal gets met with worst-case scenarios and resistance to change. These aren't worst-case scenarios, I replied firmly. These are regulatory requirements based on federal law and industry standards. I'm not opposing change. I'm advocating for smart change that doesn't expose us to unnecessary risk. Michael's jaw tightened visibly. I think we need to discuss this privately, he said, effectively ending the meeting and leaving the department, heads looking uncomfortable and confused. That private conversation never happened. Instead, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Over the following weeks, I found myself increasingly isolated from important decisions. Budget meetings were scheduled without my input. Financial reports were prepared by outside consultants who lacked understanding of our operations. Most telling of all, I overheard Michael's assistant on a phone call that made my blood run cold. Michael wants a more compliant financial team, she was saying to someone from corporate headquarters. Someone who won't push back on cost reduction initiatives. He feels the current analyst is too focused on problems instead of solutions. I realized then that my termination wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. Michael hadn't hired me, hadn't chosen me for my role, and clearly didn't value the institutional knowledge and regulatory expertise I brought to the position. In his mind, I was an obstacle to implementing his vision for the company, rather than a resource who could help him achieve his goals while avoiding costly mistakes. But while Michael was planning my departure, I was quietly doing something else entirely. I was documenting everything. Not out of paranoia or spite, but because the numbers weren't adding up and the potential consequences of his proposed changes were too serious to ignore. I had spent 6 years building relationships with regulatory officials, industry experts, and safety consultants who understood the complex requirements our company faced. Working on my own time, using publicly available data and my professional expertise, I began building a comprehensive analysis of what Michael's budget cuts would actually cost the company. Not just in immediate savings, but in long-term consequences, regulatory compliance, and risk management. I reached out to Patricia Williams, our former CEO who had retired but remained on the board as an advisor. Patricia had mentored me for years and had always emphasized that financial leadership meant protecting the company's future, not just optimizing quarterly results. Jennifer, Patricia said during one of our private conversations, I'm hearing concerning things about the direction Michael wants to take the company. The board brought him in to improve profitability, but not at the expense of everything we've built over the past decade. I shared my concerns about the proposed budget cuts and their potential impact on regulatory compliance. Patricia listened carefully, asking detailed questions about specific regulations and industry standards. Her experience as a former CEO gave her insight into the broader implications of Michael's proposals. This isn't just about cost management, she said finally. This is about fundamental business philosophy. Michael sees short-term cost reduction as the path to profitability. But in our industry, cutting the wrong costs can destroy years of progress and put the entire company at risk. Our conversations gave me confidence that my concerns were valid and that someone in leadership understood the stakes involved. But I also knew that challenging a new CEO's directives was risky, especially for someone in my position. I had worked too hard to get where I was to jeopardize my career lightly. The irony was that I genuinely wanted Michael to succeed. A thriving company was good for everyone: employees, customers, shareholders, and the community. If he could find ways to improve efficiency without compromising safety or quality, I would have been his strongest supporter. But his proposals weren't about smart cost management. They were about rapid cost reduction without regard for consequences. As I prepared for what I suspected might be my final presentation to the board, I focused on demonstrating the value of strategic financial management. The quarterly review I presented that day represented everything I had learned about balancing profitability with responsibility. The 18% cost reduction we had achieved wasn't just a number. It was the result of careful analysis, process improvement, and intelligent resource allocation. Standing in that boardroom, seeing the appreciation in the board members' faces, I felt proud of what we had accomplished together. The cost savings were substantial, but they had been achieved without compromising the values that made Midwest Manufacturing a company worth working for. We had improved efficiency while maintaining safety standards. We had reduced expenses while preserving quality. We had increased profitability while staying true to our regulatory commitments. That presentation represented 6 years of professional growth, countless hours of careful analysis, and a deep understanding of what it meant to be a responsible financial steward. It also represented my final act as Chief Financial Analyst at Midwest Manufacturing Solutions, though I didn't know it at the time. When Michael stood up at the back of the room after my presentation, I thought he might offer congratulations or express appreciation for the work my team had done. Instead, he delivered the words that would end my employment and begin a chain of events that would ultimately transform both my career and the company itself. The silence in that boardroom was deafening. Michael's words hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Effective immediately, Jennifer will be stepping down from her position. While her conservative approach has merit, we need more aggressive cost-cutting to meet our new growth targets. I felt the eyes of every board member on me, their expressions ranging from shock to uncomfortable confusion. These were people who had just applauded my presentation, who had praised the cost savings I had achieved while maintaining quality and safety standards. Now they were witnessing my public dismissal by a man who had been with the company for exactly 4 months. Michael continued speaking, his voice gaining confidence as he outlined his reasoning. Jennifer's tendency to question necessary budget reductions has become a bottleneck to our efficiency initiatives. Her reluctance to implement deeper cuts, particularly her concerns about our quality assurance and safety training budgets, doesn't align with our new direction. The words stung not just because they were dismissive, but because they completely misrepresented my professional approach. I had never opposed cost reductions. In fact, I had led multiple successful cost-saving initiatives that had saved the company millions of dollars over the years. What I had opposed were reckless cuts that would expose the company to regulatory violations, safety risks, and long-term financial damage. Chairman Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Michael, this seems rather sudden. Jennifer's track record speaks for itself, and her presentation today demonstrates exactly the kind of financial leadership we value." Michael's smile became more forced. "Robert, I appreciate Jennifer's past contributions, but we're at a critical juncture. The market demands rapid adaptation, and we can't afford to be held back by excessive caution. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good of the organization." I watched this exchange with growing clarity about what was really happening. Michael wasn't just firing me for questioning his budget cuts. He was making an example of me, demonstrating to the entire board that his authority was absolute and that dissent would not be tolerated. In his mind, removing me would clear the path for implementing his cost reduction agenda without interference. Patricia Williams, our former CEO and current board advisor, spoke up from the far end of the table. "Michael, what timeline are we looking at for this transition? Jennifer manages complex relationships with regulatory agencies and has institutional knowledge that would be difficult to replace immediately." "I've already identified her replacement," Michael replied smoothly. "We'll be bringing in a financial analyst with more experience in aggressive cost management. The transition will be seamless." That's when I realized he had been planning this moment for weeks, possibly months. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in response to my questioning his budget proposals. This was a calculated move to eliminate opposition to his agenda. He had found his replacement, planned the timing, and chosen to deliver the news in the most public and humiliating way possible. The old Jennifer might have become emotional, might have pleaded her case, or pointed out the injustice of the situation. But 6 years in corporate finance had taught me that dignity was often the most powerful response to professional betrayal. I closed my laptop slowly, gathered my materials, and stood up with as much composure as I could manage. "I appreciate the clarity, Michael," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil I felt inside. "I wish you and the company continued success." I didn't argue. I didn't list my accomplishments or point out the flaws in his reasoning. I didn't appeal to the board members who had just praised my work. Instead, I maintained the professional dignity that had served me well throughout my career, even as my world was crumbling around me. As I walked toward the conference room door, I could feel the uncomfortable tension in the room. Board members shifted in their seats, clearly unsettled by what they had just witnessed. Some avoided eye contact entirely, while others looked at me with expressions of sympathy and confusion. Patricia Williams caught my eye and gave me an almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that I would later understand carried more significance than I realized at the time. The walk from the boardroom to my office felt like the longest journey of my professional life. The familiar hallways of Midwest manufacturing suddenly felt foreign, as if I were seeing them for the first time. Employees I passed in the corridors looked at me with curiosity and concern, sensing that something significant had just occurred, but not understanding what it meant. My office, which had been my professional sanctuary for 6 years, now felt like a crime scene. Everything was exactly as I had left it that morning. Family photos on the desk, industry awards on the walls, stacks of financial reports I had been reviewing. But the context had changed completely. These were no longer the tools of my daily work. They were artifacts of a career that had just ended. I sat down at my desk and tried to process what had just happened. Michael had essentially accused me of being an obstacle to the company's success, of being too conservative and resistant to necessary changes. The irony was bitter. I had just presented a report showing how strategic cost management had improved our financial position significantly. The conservative approach he criticized had actually delivered results that exceeded industry benchmarks. But I also realized that Michael's criticism revealed something important about his perspective. He viewed financial analysis as a tool for validating predetermined decisions, rather than as a method for evaluating the wisdom of those decisions. In his mind, my role should have been to find ways to justify his budget cuts, not to assess whether those cuts were advisable in the first place. As I began the process of packing my personal belongings, I reflected on the warning signs I had observed over the past few months. The meetings I wasn't invited to, the decisions made without my input, the subtle but persistent pressure to approve cost-cutting measures that didn't make financial sense. I had tried to navigate these challenges professionally, assuming that Michael's approach would moderate as he gained more familiarity with our operations. Instead, his approach had become more rigid and authoritarian. He had surrounded himself with outside consultants who reinforced his preconceptions rather than challenging them with industry-specific knowledge. He had dismissed the concerns of experienced employees as resistance to change rather than valuable expertise that could inform better decisions. The most troubling aspect of the situation wasn't just my termination. It was the implications for the company's future. Michael's budget cuts weren't just aggressive, they were dangerous. The safety training reductions would leave employees inadequately prepared for workplace hazards. The elimination of quality control positions would compromise our ability to maintain the standards that had built our reputation. The deferred maintenance would create equipment failures that could shut down production lines and endanger workers. But what Michael didn't understand was that I had been preparing for this possibility. Not because I anticipated being fired, but because I had recognized the potential consequences of his cost-cutting agenda and felt a professional obligation to document them thoroughly. Over the past 2 months, I had been quietly building a comprehensive analysis of what his proposed changes would actually cost the company. Working on my own time, using publicly available regulatory data and industry standards, I had calculated the potential penalties for safety violations, the costs of quality failures, and the long-term financial impact of deferred maintenance. The numbers were sobering. Michael's cuts could expose the company to millions of dollars in penalties, lawsuits, and operational disruptions. I had also been building relationships with people who shared my concerns. Sarah Chen from Quality. Assurance had been documenting how the proposed cuts to her department would affect regulatory compliance. Tom Rodriguez from Safety Training had been tracking the impact on OSHA requirements. Maria Santos from Human Resources had been analyzing the legal implications of reducing safety protocols. Together, we had developed a detailed understanding of how Michael's budget cuts would affect every aspect of the company's operations. We hadn't been conspiring against him. We had been doing our jobs as responsible professionals who understood that cost management required balancing savings against risks. Patricia Williams, our former CEO and current board advisor, had been particularly helpful in this process. During our private conversations, she had encouraged me to document my concerns thoroughly and to think strategically about how to present them if the opportunity arose. She had also shared her own observations about Michael's leadership style and her concerns about the direction he was taking the company. "Jennifer," she had told me during one of our coffee meetings, "I've seen this pattern before. New leaders come in with aggressive cost-cutting agendas, convinced that previous management was too conservative. Sometimes they're right, but more often they're missing important context about why certain expenses exist in the first place." Her words had proven prophetic. Michael had indeed dismissed the institutional knowledge that could have informed better decisions. He had viewed long-standing practices as outdated rather than time-tested. He had seen regulatory compliance as bureaucratic overhead rather than essential protection for the company and its employees. As I packed my desk that afternoon, I found myself thinking about the junior analysts I had mentored over the years. What would happen to them under Michael's leadership? Would they be encouraged to ask hard questions and challenge assumptions? Or would they be expected to simply validate predetermined decisions? Would they learn to balance cost management with risk assessment? Or would they be taught that aggressive cost-cutting was always the right answer? The thought of these young professionals being led astray by Michael's misguided approach added another layer of concern to my situation. I had always believed that financial leadership carried a responsibility to develop the next generation of professionals, to teach them not just technical skills, but also ethical judgment and strategic thinking. Michael's approach seemed to prioritize compliance over competence, obedience over expertise. The financial analyst he planned to bring in to replace me might have impressive credentials, but would they have the industry knowledge and regulatory expertise necessary to navigate the complex challenges our company faced? As evening approached, I finished packing my personal belongings and prepared to leave the office for the final time. The building was nearly empty, most employees having left for the day without knowing that a significant change in leadership had just occurred. Tomorrow they would learn about my departure, probably through a brief announcement that would frame it as a voluntary transition or mutual agreement. But I knew the truth, and more importantly, I had documented the truth. Michael's budget cuts weren't just misguided. They were potentially catastrophic. The company he was trying to save money for could end up losing far more than it gained, through regulatory penalties, safety incidents, and quality failures. Walking to my car that evening, I felt a mixture of emotions: anger at the injustice of my treatment, sadness at leaving a company I had devoted 6 years to building, but also a strange sense of relief. I no longer had to fight an uphill battle against dangerous cost-cutting measures. I no longer had to watch Michael make decisions that could hurt the company and its employees. Instead, I could focus on what I did best: analyzing financial data, understanding regulatory requirements, and developing strategies that balanced profitability with responsibility. The question was whether I would have the opportunity to use those skills to help the company I still cared about, despite the way I had been treated. The answer to that question would come sooner than I expected, in ways that would surprise everyone involved, including me. Michael had removed what he saw as an obstacle to his agenda, but he had also eliminated the person who best understood the financial and regulatory landscape he was trying to navigate. The consequences of that decision would become apparent very quickly, and they would change everything for both of us. As I drove home that evening, I couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. Michael had fired me for questioning budget cuts that could potentially cost the company millions of dollars. Soon, he would discover that the person he had dismissed as overly cautious was actually the one who had been protecting him from making the biggest financial mistake of his career. The audit results that would eventually emerge from this situation would indeed shock everyone, but perhaps no one more than Michael himself. He had assumed that removing me would clear the path for implementing his cost-cutting agenda. Instead, it would reveal just how much he had been depending on expertise he didn't recognize or value. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The first week after my termination passed in a surreal haze of unemployment that I had never experienced before. For 6 years, my days had been structured around financial deadlines, regulatory reports, and strategic planning meetings. Suddenly, I found myself waking up without anywhere to go, without urgent emails demanding my attention, without the familiar rhythm of corporate life that had defined my identity for so long. Michael had wasted no time implementing his transition plan. Within 48 hours of my departure, he had announced my replacement, a 28-year-old financial analyst named Brandon Walsh, who had been recruited from a consulting firm in Boston. Brandon's resume was impressive on paper: MBA from a prestigious business school, experience with corporate restructuring, and a track record of implementing aggressive cost reduction strategies. What Brandon lacked was any experience in manufacturing, any understanding of regulatory compliance in our industry, and any familiarity with the complex vendor relationships and operational nuances that had taken me years to master. But Michael seemed confident that technical expertise was less important than philosophical alignment with his cost-cutting agenda. Sarah Chen called me on Wednesday morning, her voice tight with anxiety. "Jennifer, you need to know what's happening. Here." Brandon started yesterday, and he's already making changes based on Michael's proposals. The safety training budget has been cut by 60%, effective immediately. Tom's department is scrambling to figure out how to maintain OSHA compliance with less than half their previous resources. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. What about the quality control positions? Has Michael moved forward with those eliminations? 2 people were let go yesterday, Sarah replied. Experienced inspectors who knew our processes inside and out. Brandon told us that automated systems and statistical sampling would be more efficient than human oversight. I tried to explain that our regulatory requirements mandate specific inspection protocols, but he said those were outdated practices that needed to be modernized. The conversation confirmed my worst fears about Michael's approach. He wasn't just cutting costs. He was dismantling systems that had been carefully built to ensure compliance and safety. The fact that Brandon was implementing these changes, without fully understanding their implications, made the situation even more dangerous. Tom Rodriguez reached out later that same day. "Jennifer, I hate to bother you, but I'm in an impossible position. I've been ordered to reduce our safety training program by 60%, but I can't figure out how to do that without violating federal regulations. When I brought my concerns to Brandon, he told me to think creatively and find more efficient delivery methods." I could hear the frustration in Tom's voice. He was a dedicated safety professional who had spent 15 years building training programs that not only met regulatory requirements, but had helped reduce workplace incidents to near zero. Now he was being asked to dismantle those programs in the name of cost efficiency. "Tom, have you documented your concerns about regulatory compliance?" I asked. "I've sent several emails to Brandon and copied Michael, but they keep telling me that other companies have successfully reduced training costs and that I need to be more innovative in my approach. They don't seem to understand that innovation in safety training doesn't mean eliminating essential components." The pattern was becoming clear. Michael and Brandon were approaching cost reduction as if it were a purely mathematical exercise, without considering the regulatory and operational context that made certain expenses necessary rather than optional. They were so focused on achieving immediate savings that they couldn't see the potential long-term costs of their decisions. Maria Santos from Human Resources provided another piece of the puzzle when she called me Thursday evening. "Jennifer, I'm seeing things that worry me from a legal liability standpoint. The changes to safety protocols and quality control procedures could expose us to significant lawsuits if something goes wrong. I've tried to raise these concerns with Michael, but he keeps saying that legal risks are acceptable as long as we're following industry best practices." "Nor, what industry best practices is he referring to?" I asked. "That's the problem. He's citing examples from completely different industries with different regulatory environments. He's applying cost-cutting strategies that might work for a software company or a retail chain to a manufacturing operation with specific safety and quality requirements." The conversation with Maria crystallized something that had been bothering me since my termination. Michael wasn't just making poor decisions about cost management. He was demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of the industry we operated in. His background in consulting had given him exposure to various cost reduction techniques, but it hadn't provided him with the deep industry knowledge necessary to apply those techniques appropriately. As the week progressed, I began receiving calls from other employees throughout the company. Some were former colleagues seeking advice about the changes being implemented. Others were vendors and external partners who were confused about new policies and procedures that seemed to contradict long-standing agreements and relationships. One particularly troubling call came from Janet Morrison, an inspector from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration who had worked with our company for several years. "Jennifer, I'm calling to give you a heads up that we've received some concerning reports about changes to your safety training programs. We're planning an unscheduled inspection next month to verify compliance with federal regulations." My heart sank. An unscheduled OSHA inspection was exactly the kind of regulatory scrutiny that Michael's cost cuts had made more likely. "Janet, I should mention that I'm no longer with Midwest Manufacturing. You'll need to coordinate with the new financial analyst, Brandon Walsh." "I'm sorry to hear that," Janet replied. "You were always very knowledgeable about compliance requirements. I hope whoever replaced you understands the regulatory environment as well as you did." I wished I could share Janet's hope, but based on what I had observed, Brandon's understanding of regulatory requirements was limited at best. The prospect of an OSHA inspection while the company was implementing dramatic reductions to safety training filled me with dread. Not for my own sake, since I was no longer employed there, but for the workers whose safety could be compromised by inadequate training. The following Monday brought news that confirmed my worst fears. Sarah Chen called me in tears. Jennifer, we had our first serious workplace accident since 2019. One of the newer employees was injured operating equipment that he hadn't received proper training on due to the budget cuts. He's going to be okay, but it could have been much worse. The accident was exactly the kind of incident that comprehensive safety training was designed to prevent. The employee had been hired recently and was scheduled to complete advanced equipment training, but those sessions had been canceled as part of Michael's 60% reduction in safety training costs. Instead, he had received only basic orientation and was expected to learn advanced procedures through on-the-job experience. "What's Michael's response to the accident?" I asked. "He's calling it an isolated incident and says it demonstrates the need for better employee attention to safety protocols." Brandon suggested that we might need to implement more disciplinary measures for safety violations rather than expanding training programs. The response was both predictable and infuriating. Rather than recognizing that the accident was a direct result of inadequate training caused by budget cuts, Michael was blaming the employee and proposing punitive measures. It was a classic example of how cost-cutting decisions could create problems that were then attributed to other factors. But the workplace accident was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, other consequences of Michael's budget cuts began to emerge. Quality control issues that had been caught early in the manufacturing process were now making it through to finished products because the experienced inspectors who would have identified them were no longer employed. Equipment that had been maintained proactively was beginning to show signs of wear and malfunction because preventive maintenance had been deferred to save money. Brandon was struggling to manage these emerging problems while also trying to implement additional cost-cutting measures. According to Sarah, he was working 16-hour days trying to understand systems that I had managed efficiently for years. The institutional knowledge that Michael had dismissed as unnecessary was proving to be far more valuable than he had realized. The breaking point came during the third week after my termination. Tom Rodriguez called me on Friday afternoon, his voice barely controlled. "Jennifer, I need to ask you a favor, and I know it's not fair to put you in this position. Brandon and Michael are demanding that I sign off on safety protocols that I believe violate OSHA regulations. They're threatening to fire me if I don't approve the changes. But I could lose my professional certification if I sign documents that I know are non-compliant." Tom's dilemma highlighted the ethical dimension of Michael's cost-cutting agenda. He wasn't just asking employees to work more efficiently. He was asking them to compromise professional standards and potentially violate regulations. The pressure he was putting on Tom was essentially asking him to choose between his job and his professional integrity. "Tom, you cannot sign documents that you believe violate safety regulations," I told him firmly. "Your professional certification and your conscience are worth more than any job. Document your concerns in writing, and if they terminate you for refusing to approve non-compliant protocols, you'll have grounds for a wrongful termination lawsuit." "I know you're right," Tom replied, "but I have a family to support, and jobs in safety management aren't easy to find. I feel like I'm trapped between doing what's right and protecting my livelihood." Tom's situation was heartbreaking because it represented the human cost of Michael's misguided leadership. Experienced, ethical professionals were being forced to choose between their principles and their paychecks. The company was losing not just institutional knowledge, but also the moral compass that had guided its operations for years. That weekend, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my career and ultimately save the company from a catastrophic mistake. I called Patricia Williams and asked if we could meet privately to discuss the situation at Midwest Manufacturing. Patricia had been watching the developments with growing concern. As a former CEO and current board advisor, she understood the implications of Michael's changes better than most board members. She had also been receiving calls from employees throughout the company who were struggling with the new policies and procedures. "Jennifer, I'm glad you called," Patricia said when we met at a coffee shop downtown. "I've been hearing troubling reports from multiple departments about safety concerns and quality issues. The board is starting to ask questions about the effectiveness of Michael's cost-cutting initiatives. I shared with Patricia the detailed analysis I had been developing of Michael's budget cuts and their potential consequences. The numbers were sobering. The company was facing potential OSHA penalties of up to $400,000, possible EPA violations that could result in operational shutdowns, and quality control failures that could lead to product recalls and customer lawsuits. More importantly, I had documented the systematic dismantling of safety and quality systems that had taken years to build. The cost savings that Michael was achieving through budget cuts were being offset by increased accident rates, quality problems, and regulatory scrutiny that would ultimately cost far more than the original expenses. Patricia listened carefully as I presented my analysis, asking detailed questions about specific regulations and industry standards. Her experience as a former CEO gave her insight into the broader implications of Michael's approach and the potential impact on the company's long-term viability. "Jennifer, this isn't just about financial management," she said finally. "This is about fundamental business philosophy and leadership competence. Michael appears to be making decisions without understanding their full implications, and the consequences could be severe." We discussed the possibility of presenting my analysis to the board, but Patricia cautioned that timing would be crucial. The board hired Michael to improve profitability, and they're seeing short-term cost savings that look impressive on paper. They may not be receptive to criticism of his approach unless there's clear evidence of problems. "What kind of evidence would be convincing?" I asked. "Regulatory violations, safety incidents, quality failures. Concrete examples of how the cost cuts are actually costing the company money rather than saving it. Unfortunately, that means waiting for problems to occur rather than preventing them." The conversation with Patricia gave me clarity about my situation. I could continue to watch from the sidelines as Michael's misguided policies damaged the company I had devoted 6 years to building, or I could prepare to help when the inevitable crisis occurred. I chose to prepare. Over the following weeks, I continued to monitor the situation at Midwest Manufacturing through informal conversations with former colleagues. The picture that emerged was increasingly troubling. Safety incidents were becoming more frequent. Quality control problems were affecting customer satisfaction. Equipment failures were disrupting production schedules. Meanwhile, Brandon was struggling to manage the complex financial and regulatory environment that I had navigated successfully for years. According to Sarah, he was spending most of his time putting out fires rather than conducting strategic analysis. The cost savings that Michael had promised were being eroded by increased expenses related to accidents, quality problems, and regulatory compliance issues. The situation reached a crisis point when Janet Morrison from OSHA conducted her unscheduled inspection. The inspection revealed multiple violations of federal safety regulations, including inadequate training documentation, missing safety protocols, and equipment that had not been properly maintained. The preliminary findings suggested penalties that could exceed the total amount saved through Michael's budget cuts. When Tom Rodriguez called to tell me about the inspection results, his voice was filled with a mixture of vindication and despair. "Jennifer, everything you predicted is coming true. The OSHA inspector found exactly the problems you identified in your analysis. But instead of acknowledging that the budget cuts caused these problems, Michael is blaming individual employees and demanding even stricter enforcement of safety rules." The OSHA inspection was the evidence Patricia had said would be necessary to convince the board that Michael's approach was fundamentally flawed. But it was also confirmation that the company I cared about was facing serious consequences because of decisions I had been fired for opposing. As I prepared for what I suspected would be a crucial conversation with Patricia and possibly the board, I reflected on the irony of my situation. I had been terminated for questioning budget cuts that were supposedly necessary for the company's financial health. Now those same budget cuts were exposing the company to financial penalties and operational problems that far exceeded any savings they had generated. The audit results that would eventually emerge from this crisis would indeed shock everyone. But they would also provide an opportunity to demonstrate the value of thoughtful financial analysis and responsible leadership. Michael had removed what he saw as an obstacle to his agenda, but he had also eliminated the person who could have helped him avoid the biggest mistake of his career. The next phase of this story would test everything I had learned about leadership, integrity, and the courage to speak truth to power, even when doing so came at a personal cost. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 6 weeks after my termination. Patricia Williams had called me the previous Friday with news that the board had requested an independent review of the company's financial and operational status following the OSHA inspection and mounting concerns about increased accident rates and quality control failures. "Jennifer, the board wants to understand what's happening," Patricia had explained during our phone conversation. "The cost savings Michael promised are being offset by unexpected expenses, and several board members are questioning whether his budget cuts were as strategic as he claimed." I arrived at the Midwest manufacturing headquarters 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting, carrying a leather briefcase containing 6 weeks of carefully documented analysis. The building looked exactly the same as it had when I left, but walking through those familiar corridors felt like returning to a place that had fundamentally changed in my absence. The executive conference room was already occupied when I entered. Michael sat at one end of the mahogany table, looking haggard and defensive. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by barely concealed anxiety. Brandon Walsh sat beside him, frantically shuffling through a stack of financial reports that appeared to be hastily prepared. The board members were seated around the table with expressions ranging from concern to frustration. Chairman Robert Hayes looked up as I entered and nodded gravely. "Jennifer, thank you for agreeing to meet with us on short notice. We know this situation is unusual, but we need to understand some discrepancies between projected savings and actual results." Patricia Williams gestured to an empty chair across from Michael. As I took my seat, I could feel his eyes on me, though he avoided direct eye contact. The man who had confidently dismissed my concerns about budget cut 6 weeks earlier now appeared to realize that the financial analyst he had terminated might hold answers to questions he couldn't address. Robert Hayes opened the meeting by outlining the board's concerns. Since implementing the new cost reduction initiatives, we've seen some unexpected developments that require explanation. While we initially observed the projected savings, we're now dealing with regulatory penalties, increased insurance claims, and operational disruptions that weren't anticipated in the original budget projections. He turned to Michael. "We need to understand how these additional costs factor into the overall financial impact of the changes you implemented." Michael cleared his throat and began what sounded like a prepared statement. "The challenges we're experiencing are typical of any major operational transition. Some employees have been resistant to change, and we've had to address compliance issues that weren't properly managed under the previous financial leadership." I felt my jaw clench at his attempt to blame the problems on my previous management, but I remained silent. Patricia had advised me to let Michael present his case first before responding to the board's questions. Brandon jumped in to support his boss. "We've identified several areas where previous financial controls were too restrictive. By eliminating unnecessary safety training redundancies and streamlining quality control processes, we've achieved significant cost reductions that will benefit the company long-term." Robert Hayes frowned. "Brandon, can you explain why our insurance premiums have increased by 30% since these changes were implemented? Our broker is citing increased claims activity and higher risk assessments." Brandon shuffled through his papers nervously. "There have been some minor incidents, but nothing that indicates a systemic problem. The insurance increases are likely due to market conditions rather than operational changes." That's when Patricia Williams spoke up. "Actually, I've reviewed The insurance company's risk assessment report. They specifically cite the reduction in safety training programs and elimination of quality control positions as factors that increased our risk profile. Jennifer, you prepared an analysis of potential insurance implications when these budget cuts were first proposed. Could you share your findings with the board? I opened my briefcase and withdrew a comprehensive report that I had prepared during my weeks of unemployment. Certainly. When Michael first proposed the 60% reduction in safety training and elimination of quality control positions, I analyzed the potential impact on our insurance costs and regulatory compliance. I distributed copies of my analysis to each board member, watching Michael's face grow increasingly pale as they began reading. The report detailed how reducing safety training below federal requirements would likely result in increased accident rates, higher insurance premiums, and potential OSHA penalties. It also projected the costs of quality control failures, including customer complaints, product recalls, and regulatory violations. The analysis shows that the proposed budget cuts would save approximately $240,000 annually, I continued, but would expose the company to potential costs exceeding $800,000 in the first year alone. Board member Susan Martinez looked up from the report. These projections appear to have been remarkably accurate. We've already faced OSHA penalties of $120,000, and our insurance company is demanding additional premiums of approximately $90,000 annually. Michael's carefully prepared composure finally cracked. Jennifer's analysis was based on worst-case scenarios that were extremely unlikely to occur. No one could have predicted that we would face such extensive regulatory scrutiny. I responded calmly but firmly. Actually, Michael, the analysis was based on historical data and regulatory requirements. The OSHA inspection wasn't unpredictable. It was inevitable once we fell below compliance standards for safety training documentation. Robert Hayes leaned forward. Jennifer, you're saying that you anticipated these regulatory problems when the budget cuts were first proposed? Yes, and I documented my concerns in multiple emails and reports that were dismissed as being overly conservative. The regulatory requirements for our industry aren't suggestions. They're legal mandates with specific penalties for non-compliance. I pulled out another folder containing email correspondence from my final weeks at the company. I repeatedly warned that the proposed cuts would expose us to regulatory violations, but my concerns were characterized as resistance to change rather than legitimate risk management. Patricia Williams added her perspective. The board should know that Jennifer reached out to me several weeks before her termination to discuss these concerns. She wasn't trying to obstruct cost-cutting initiatives. She was trying to prevent the company from making costly mistakes. The room fell silent as board members absorbed this information. The narrative that Michael had constructed about my termination, that I was an obstacle to necessary cost reductions, was falling apart as the actual consequences of his decisions became clear. Brandon made one final attempt to defend their approach. Even with these temporary setbacks, the overall cost savings still represent a net positive for the company's financial position. That's when I presented the most damaging piece of evidence in my analysis. Actually, Brandon, when you factor in all the additional costs, OSHA penalties, increased insurance premiums, quality control failures, equipment repairs from deferred maintenance, and overtime costs to compensate for reduced staffing, the net financial impact of the budget cuts is negative $460,000 in the first year. I distributed a detailed financial breakdown showing how each of Michael's cost-cutting measures had generated hidden expenses that exceeded the savings. The safety training cuts had led to accidents that resulted in worker compensation claims and productivity losses. The elimination of quality control positions had caused defective products to reach customers, resulting in returns, recalls, and damaged relationships. The deferred maintenance had caused equipment failures that shut down production lines and required emergency repairs at premium costs. Susan Martinez studied the numbers carefully. Jennifer, This analysis suggests that the company would have been better off financially if no budget cuts had been implemented at all. That's correct, I replied. Strategic cost management requires understanding the difference between expenses that add value and expenses that create unnecessary overhead. Safety training and quality control aren't overhead. They're investments in operational excellence that prevent much larger costs down the road. Michael's face had gone from pale to ashen as the full scope of his miscalculations became apparent. The board members were reviewing my documentation with expressions of growing concern and frustration. The cost-cutting initiative that was supposed to improve the company's financial position had actually made it significantly worse. Robert Hayes addressed Michael directly. It appears that the financial leadership changes you implemented have resulted in substantial unexpected costs. How do you plan to address these issues? Michael's response was barely audible. We're working on corrective measures to address the compliance issues and operational challenges. What corrective measures? Patricia Williams asked pointedly. Brandon answered for his boss. We're evaluating options for restoring some of the safety training programs and potentially rehiring quality control staff. I couldn't help but respond to the irony of their solution. In other words, you're planning to reverse the budget cuts that you fired me for questioning, at a cost that now includes not only the original expenses, but also penalties, premium, costs, and the additional expense of rebuilding programs that should never have been eliminated. The board members exchanged glances that conveyed volumes about their assessment of Michael's leadership. Chairman Hayes spoke for the group. Michael, the board needs to reassess the current financial leadership structure. The cost-cutting initiative you championed has created more problems than it solved. 2 hours later, I walked out of that conference room with an offer that I had never expected to receive. The board had asked Michael to resign immediately, and had offered me the position of Chief Executive Officer, not just Chief Financial Officer. Jennifer, Robert Hayes had said as the meeting concluded, you've demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and risk management expertise that we need in leadership. Your analysis prevented a bad situation from becoming catastrophic, and your professional handling of a difficult situation shows the kind of character we want leading this company. The irony was overwhelming. 6 weeks earlier, I had been fired for questioning budget cuts that Michael claimed were necessary for the company's success. Now I was being offered the position of CEO because those same budget cuts had nearly destroyed the company's financial stability and regulatory standing. Patricia Williams walked with me to the elevator after the meeting. Jennifer, you handled that beautifully. You presented facts without emotion, maintained professional dignity, and demonstrated exactly why the board made the right choice. I never wanted Michael to fail, I replied honestly. I wanted the company to succeed. If he had been willing to listen to concerns about his budget cuts, we could have found ways to reduce costs without creating bigger problems. That's what makes you the right person for this job, Patricia said. Leadership isn't about being right. It's about making decisions that serve the organization's long-term interests, even when those decisions are difficult or unpopular. 3 months later, I was sitting in the CEO's office, reviewing quarterly reports that showed the company's remarkable turnaround. We had reversed Michael's dangerous budget cuts while implementing smart cost reduction strategies that actually improved efficiency without compromising safety or quality. Our insurance premiums had returned to normal levels. OSHA had lifted their compliance concerns. Customer satisfaction ratings were higher than they had been in years. The total cost of Michael's 6-week experiment in aggressive cost-cutting had exceeded $1.2 million when all expenses were factored in. But the lessons learned from that experience had made the company stronger and more financially disciplined than ever before. I established new protocols for financial decision-making that required comprehensive risk assessment before implementing any cost reduction initiatives. I created cross-functional teams that included safety, quality, and regulatory experts in all budget planning processes. Most importantly, I fostered a culture where questioning assumptions and raising concerns was valued rather than punished. The company's financial performance under my leadership exceeded all projections. We achieved sustainable cost reductions of over 15% while maintaining the highest safety and quality standards in our industry. Our regulatory compliance became a model for other manufacturing companies. Our employee retention rates improved dramatically as workers felt safer and more valued. 6 months after becoming CEO, I received a letter from Tom Rodriguez, who had remained with the company as Director of Safety Training. "Jennifer, you've created the kind of workplace I always hoped to be part of. Employees feel empowered to speak up about safety concerns, and management listens rather than dismisses their input. The safety training programs we've implemented are setting new industry standards." The transformation went beyond financial metrics. The company had become a place where experienced professionals could use their expertise to make meaningful contributions rather than simply following orders. Junior employees were encouraged to ask questions and challenge assumptions. The culture of fear and compliance that Michael had created was replaced by one of collaboration and continuous improvement. Looking back on the experience, I realized that being fired for questioning dangerous budget cuts had been the best thing that could have happened to my career. It had forced me to document my expertise, articulate my professional values, and demonstrate leadership under pressure. Most importantly, it had taught me that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is say no to bad ideas, even when those ideas come from people in positions of authority. The audit results that shocked everyone weren't just about financial numbers. They were about the difference between leadership that serves short-term interests and leadership that builds sustainable success. Michael had focused on immediate cost savings without considering long-term consequences. I focused on creating value that would benefit the company, its employees, and its customers for years to come. The story of my termination and ultimate vindication became a case study that was taught in business schools and discussed at industry conferences. But for me, the most important outcome was knowing that the company I had devoted my career to was stronger, safer, and more successful than ever before. Sometimes being fired for doing the right thing is the first step toward finding the right place to make a real difference. In my case, that place turned out to be exactly where I started, but in a role I had never imagined, and with the authority to implement the kind of responsible financial leadership I had always believed in. 1 year after that pivotal board meeting, that changed everything. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, watching the morning shift begin at Midwest Manufacturing Solutions. The view from the CEO suite offered a panoramic perspective of the factory floor below, where employees moved with purpose and confidence through their daily routines. The sight filled me with a profound sense of accomplishment that went far beyond personal vindication. The transformation of the company over the past 12 months had exceeded every expectation. What had begun as a crisis management situation following Michael's catastrophic budget cuts had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of how a manufacturing company could operate with both profitability and integrity. The numbers told an impressive story, but the human impact was what truly mattered to me as I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. Our safety record had become the envy of the industry. 0 workplace accidents in the past 8 months. A dramatic reversal from the spike in incidents that had occurred during Michael's brief tenure. Tom Rodriguez had rebuilt the safety training programs from the ground up, incorporating best practices from across the manufacturing sector while maintaining compliance with all federal regulations. The comprehensive training protocols we had implemented weren't just meeting OSHA requirements, they were setting new standards that other companies were beginning to adopt. The financial transformation was equally remarkable. Our quarterly reports showed sustainable cost reductions of 18% compared to pre-crisis levels, achieved through strategic process improvements rather than reckless budget slashing. We had eliminated genuine inefficiencies while strengthening the core systems that protected our workers and ensured product quality. The contrast with Michael's approach couldn't have been more stark. He had pursued immediate savings without regard for consequences, while we had focused on long-term value creation that benefited all stakeholders. Employee satisfaction surveys revealed the cultural shift that I was most proud of. Workers at every level reported feeling valued, heard, and empowered to contribute their expertise to operational improvements. The climate of fear and compliance that had characterized Michael's leadership had been replaced by one of collaboration and continuous learning. Employees were no longer afraid to raise safety concerns or suggest process improvements, knowing that their input would be taken seriously rather than dismissed as resistance to change. The ripple effects of this cultural transformation extended far beyond our company walls. We had become a case study in responsible leadership that was being discussed in business schools across the country. Harvard Business Review had published an article about our turnaround titled, "When Cost-Cutting Costs More, a Case Study in Strategic Financial Management." The piece examined how short-term thinking about expenses could create long-term financial disasters, using Michael's failed budget cuts as a cautionary tale. More importantly, we had become a model for other manufacturing companies facing pressure to reduce costs in ways that might compromise safety or quality. I received regular inquiries from CEOs and CFOs seeking advice about how to balance cost management with regulatory compliance and worker safety. The consulting opportunities that emerged from our experience had created an entirely new revenue stream for the company while establishing us as thought leaders in responsible manufacturing practices. The personal growth I had experienced during this transformation was perhaps the most significant aspect of the entire journey. Being fired for questioning dangerous budget cuts had forced me to examine my own leadership philosophy and articulate values that I had previously taken for granted. The experience had taught me that true leadership sometimes required accepting short-term career risks to protect long-term organizational health. During the darkest days of unemployment following my termination, I had questioned whether my principled stance against Michael's cuts had been worth the personal cost. The answer had become clear as the consequences of his decisions unfolded. My willingness to challenge authority and document concerns had ultimately saved the company from far greater damage than what actually occurred. The vindication wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal validation that integrity and expertise still mattered in corporate America. The relationships I had rebuilt and strengthened throughout this process had become one of the most valuable aspects of my new role. Patricia Williams continued to serve as a mentor and advisor, offering wisdom drawn from decades of leadership experience. Our regular coffee meetings had evolved into strategic planning sessions that helped shape the company's long-term direction. Her support during the crisis had been instrumental in my eventual appointment as CEO, but her ongoing guidance was proving equally valuable as I navigated the challenges of executive leadership. Sarah Chen had flourished in her expanded role as Director of Quality Assurance and Regulatory Compliance. The respect for her expertise that I had insisted upon had paid dividends in improved product quality and stronger relationships with regulatory agencies. Her department had become a profit center rather than a cost center, as improved quality control had reduced returns, recalls, and customer complaints while enhancing our reputation for reliability. Tom Rodriguez had similarly thrived under leadership that valued his professional expertise. The safety training programs he had developed were now being licensed to other manufacturers, creating an additional revenue stream while spreading best practices throughout the industry. His work had earned recognition from OSHA and several industry associations, elevating both his profile and the company's reputation as a leader in workplace safety. The junior analysts I had mentored before my termination had grown into confident professionals who understood that financial analysis required balancing multiple considerations rather than simply minimizing expenses. They had learned to ask hard questions about proposed cost cuts and to present alternative strategies that achieved savings without creating risks. Their development as ethical financial professionals was perhaps the most lasting legacy of the changes we had implemented. Brandon Walsh, Michael's former protege, had initially struggled to adapt to our new approach to financial management. His consulting background had emphasized aggressive cost reduction without deep consideration of industry-specific requirements. However, he had proven willing to learn and had eventually become a valuable contributor to our more nuanced approach to cost management. His transformation from a narrow-minded cost cutter to a strategic financial analyst demonstrated that people could change when given proper guidance and support. The board of directors had undergone their own learning experience throughout this crisis. The initial enthusiasm for Michael's aggressive cost-cutting agenda had given way to a deeper understanding of the complexities involved in manufacturing operations. Board meetings now included comprehensive discussions of regulatory, compliance, worker safety, and long-term operational sustainability, rather than focusing solely on quarterly profit margins. Chairman Robert Hayes had become one of my strongest supporters, frequently citing our turnaround as an example of the kind of strategic thinking the board wanted to encourage. His public statements about the importance of listening to experienced professionals and avoiding short-term thinking had helped establish new governance standards that other companies were beginning to adopt. The industry recognition we had received was gratifying but not unexpected. Manufacturing Today had named us Company of the Year, citing our successful integration of profitability with responsibility. The award recognized not just our financial performance, but our leadership in demonstrating that safety and quality improvements could enhance rather than hinder cost management efforts. More meaningful to me was the recognition from organizations focused on workplace safety and ethical business practices. The National Safety Council had honored our safety training programs, while the Ethics and Compliance Initiative had recognized our corporate culture transformation. These awards reflected the values-based approach to leadership that had guided our recovery from Michael's destructive tenure. The speaking opportunities that had emerged from our experience had allowed me to share lessons learned with audiences across the country. My keynote address at the National Manufacturing Conference had been titled, "The True Cost of Cost Cutting: Why Integrity Pays Dividends." The speech had resonated with executives facing similar pressures to reduce expenses in ways that might compromise core values or long-term sustainability. During these speaking engagements, I often reflected on the irony of my situation. I had been fired for questioning budget cuts that were supposedly necessary for financial success. Now I was being celebrated for the financial success we had, achieved by implementing the kind of responsible cost management I had always advocated. The vindication was complete, but more importantly, the lessons learned had created value that extended far beyond our company. The ripple effects of our transformation had influenced industry practices in ways that I had never anticipated. Several competitors had quietly adopted elements of our approach to safety training and quality control after observing our improved performance. Regulatory agencies had begun citing our programs as examples of best practices for other companies to follow. Suppliers and customers had adjusted their own practices based on the standards we had established. The impact on individual lives was what mattered most to me as I considered the full scope of what we had accomplished. Workers who had been endangered by inadequate safety training were now protected by comprehensive programs that prioritized their well-being. Families who had been affected by workplace accidents during Michael's tenure could now feel confident that their loved ones were working in a safe environment. Customers who had received defective products due to eliminated quality controls were now benefiting from enhanced inspection processes that ensured consistent reliability. The suppliers and vendors who had been pressured to reduce costs in potentially dangerous ways were now part of a supply chain that valued sustainability and ethical practices over short-term savings. The junior employees who had been thrust into roles without proper preparation were now benefiting from mentorship programs and comprehensive training that prepared them for success. The experienced professionals who had been marginalized or terminated during Michael's regime had been rehired and given the respect and authority their expertise deserved. As I prepared for another quarterly board presentation, I reflected on how different this experience was from the one that had preceded my termination. Instead of defending responsible financial practices against pressure to cut costs recklessly, I was now reporting on the success achieved through strategic cost management that enhanced rather than compromised our core capabilities. The presentation, materials spread across my desk, told a story of sustained excellence across all dimensions of our operations. Safety metrics showed continued improvement beyond industry benchmarks. Quality indicators demonstrated consistency and reliability that had strengthened customer relationships and market position. Financial performance reflected sustainable profitability achieved through operational excellence rather than corner cutting. The employee engagement scores were particularly gratifying. Workers at every level reported feeling valued and empowered to contribute their expertise to operational improvements. The suggestion program we had implemented had generated dozens of cost-saving ideas that had been evaluated on their merits rather than dismissed due to implementation costs. The collaborative approach to problem-solving had created a culture of continuous improvement that was driving innovation throughout the organization. The regulatory compliance metrics showed the dramatic turnaround from the crisis that had erupted during Michael's tenure. Our relationships with OSHA, EPA, and other agencies had been rebuilt through transparent communication and demonstrated commitment to exceeding rather than merely meeting requirements. The contrast with the adversarial relationships that had developed under Michael's leadership couldn't have been more pronounced. The vendor and supplier relationships that had been strained by pressure to reduce costs regardless of consequences had been restored through partnerships that emphasized mutual benefit and long-term sustainability. Our suppliers were now investing in improvements that benefited both companies rather than cutting corners that created risks for everyone involved. The customer satisfaction metrics reflected the quality improvements that had resulted from our commitment to comprehensive quality control. Returns and complaints had dropped to historic lows while customer loyalty scores had reached new highs. The reputation for quality and reliability that Michael's cuts had threatened was now stronger than ever. As I reviewed these metrics, I couldn't help but think about Michael's current situation. He had quickly found another CEO position at a consulting firm specializing in corporate turnarounds, where his aggressive cost-cutting approach was apparently still valued. I harbored no ill will toward him personally, but I hoped he had learned from the experience at Midwest Manufacturing about the importance of understanding industry-specific requirements before implementing broad cost reduction strategies. Brandon had chosen to remain with our company rather than follow Michael to his new position. His evolution from a narrow-minded cost-cutter to a strategic financial analyst had been remarkable to witness. He had embraced the comprehensive approach to cost management that considered all stakeholders and long-term implications rather than focusing solely on immediate savings. The transformation of our accounting and finance department had been particularly satisfying to observe. The junior analysts were now confident professionals who understood that their role involved much more than simply minimizing expenses. They had learned to evaluate proposed cost reductions for their impact on safety, quality, regulatory compliance, and long-term operational sustainability. The senior financial staff had grown into trusted advisors to department heads throughout the company. Instead of being seen as obstacles to operational improvements, they were now valued partners in finding ways to enhance efficiency without compromising core values. The collaborative relationship between finance and operations that I had always advocated was now the foundation of our success. The strategic planning process had been completely reimagined to incorporate the lessons learned from Michael's failed experiment. All proposed changes now underwent comprehensive risk assessment that considered regulatory compliance, safety implications, quality impacts, and long-term financial consequences. The short-term thinking that had characterized Michael's approach had been replaced by strategic planning that balanced immediate needs with sustainable growth. The board governance practices had evolved significantly as a result of our experience. Board members now insisted on detailed analysis of proposed changes, rather than accepting superficial presentations about cost savings. The due diligence process for major decisions had been strengthened to prevent the kind of oversight failures that had allowed Michael's dangerous cuts to be implemented without proper evaluation. The external recognition we had received had opened doors to opportunities that extended far beyond our traditional market. We had been invited to participate in industry task forces focused on developing best practices for manufacturing safety and quality. The consulting requests from other companies had created a new revenue stream while establishing us as thought leaders in responsible manufacturing. The academic partnerships that had emerged from our experience were particularly meaningful to me. Several business schools had developed case studies based on our turnaround, using our experience to teach students about the importance of comprehensive analysis in financial decision-making. The opportunity to influence the next generation of business leaders was a responsibility I took seriously. My own professional development had been transformed by the experience of being fired for doing the right thing and ultimately being vindicated by the results. The confidence that came from knowing I had stood up to pressure and been proven correct had made me a more effective leader and decision-maker. The experience had also taught me the importance of documenting concerns and building coalitions of support when challenging authority. Looking toward the future, I felt optimistic about the company's prospects and my role in continuing to build on the foundation we had established. The strategic plan we had developed called for sustained growth based on operational excellence rather than financial engineering. The investments we were making in people, systems, and capabilities were designed to create long-term competitive advantages rather than short-term cost savings. The legacy I hoped to leave was one of leadership that proved integrity and profitability were not mutually exclusive. The transformation of Midwest manufacturing from a company that nearly destroyed itself through reckless cost-cutting to one that achieved sustainable success through responsible management was a testament to the power of principled leadership. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I took one final look at the factory floor below. The workers moving through their routines with confidence and purpose represented the human dimension of leadership that could never be captured in financial reports or performance metrics. Their safety, their livelihoods, and their professional development were the responsibilities that made the job of CEO both challenging and deeply rewarding. The story of being terminated for questioning budget cuts and ultimately being vindicated by audit results would always be a defining chapter in my career. But it was just one chapter in a larger story about the importance of standing up for principles, even when doing so carried personal risks. The experience had taught me that sometimes the greatest professional achievements come from the courage to do what's right, rather than what's expedient. The shocking audit results that had exposed the flaws in Michael's approach had done more than vindicate my concerns. They had demonstrated the value of expertise, experience, and ethical leadership in complex organizational environments. The transformation that followed had proven that companies could achieve both financial success and operational excellence when guided by leaders who understood the true meaning of responsible management. 2 years had passed since that fateful board meeting that transformed my career trajectory, and I found myself standing before an audience of 300 manufacturing executives at the International Leadership Summit in Detroit. The keynote speech I was about to deliver would mark a full-circle moment in a journey that had begun with my termination for questioning dangerous budget cuts and culminated in recognition as one of the most innovative CEOs in American manufacturing. The title of my presentation was Beyond the Bottom Line: How Ethical Leadership Drives Sustainable Profitability. And as I looked out at the sea of faces in the convention center, I reflected on how dramatically my perspective on leadership had evolved. The woman who had been fired for asking hard questions about cost-cutting measures was now being asked to share her insights with leaders from companies across the globe. The invitation to deliver this keynote had come from Rebecca Thompson, president of the Manufacturing Excellence Institute, who had been following our company's transformation with great interest. During our initial conversation, she had explained why our story resonated so powerfully within the industry. "Jennifer, What you've accomplished represents something that many executives talk about but few actually achieve, proving that doing the right thing is also the profitable thing. Your willingness to challenge dangerous practices, even at personal cost, and then demonstrate a better way forward has inspired leaders throughout our sector. As I began my presentation, I shared the fundamental insight that had emerged from our experience. The most expensive costs are often the ones you don't see coming. Michael's budget cuts had appeared to save money in the immediate term, but the hidden costs, regulatory penalties, insurance increases, quality failures, and operational disruptions had ultimately cost far more than the original expenses. This principle had become central to how we approached every financial decision at Midwest Manufacturing. The audience was particularly engaged when I discussed the cultural transformation that had accompanied our financial turnaround. The climate of fear and compliance that had characterized Michael's leadership approach had been replaced by what we called engaged accountability, a system where employees felt empowered to raise concerns and suggest improvements because they knew their expertise was valued rather than viewed as resistance to change. One of the most powerful examples I shared was the story of Marcus Williams, a machine operator with 15 years of experience, who had identified a potential safety hazard during Michael's tenure, but had been told to focus on production rather than problems. Under our new leadership approach, Marcus had not only been encouraged to report the issue, but had been asked to lead a cross-functional team to develop solutions. His insights had prevented what could have been a catastrophic equipment failure, while also improving overall production efficiency. The transformation of Marcus from a silenced observer to an empowered problem solver represented something much larger than individual empowerment. It demonstrated how organizations could tap into the collective intelligence of their workforce when leadership created the right conditions for engagement. The financial impact of this cultural shift had been measurable and substantial, with employee-generated improvements contributing over $2 million in cost savings and efficiency gains over the past 18 months. During the question and answer session that followed my presentation, a CEO from an aerospace manufacturing company asked how we had managed to maintain profitability while investing heavily in safety and quality improvements. The question went to the heart of the false choice that many leaders believe they face between doing the right thing and achieving financial success. I explained that our experience had revealed this to be a false dichotomy based on short-term thinking. The investments we had made in comprehensive safety training, robust quality control systems, and proactive equipment maintenance had generated returns that far exceeded their costs. Our insurance premiums had decreased due to improved safety records. Our customer retention rates had increased due to enhanced product quality. Our regulatory compliance costs had dropped due to proactive rather than reactive approaches to compliance. Most importantly, our reputation as a responsible employer had enabled us to attract and retain top talent in a competitive labor market. The best engineers, technicians, and managers wanted to work for companies that valued their expertise and prioritized their safety. This competitive advantage in human resources had translated directly into operational excellence and financial performance. The networking reception following my keynote provided opportunities to engage in deeper conversations with fellow executives who were facing similar challenges in their own organizations. Many shared stories of pressure from boards or investors to implement cost-cutting measures that they suspected could create long-term problems. The common thread in these conversations was the difficulty of making the case for what I had come to call investment thinking versus expense thinking. Investment thinking required looking beyond immediate costs to consider long-term value creation. Expense thinking focused primarily on reducing short-term cash outflows without adequate consideration of consequences. Michael's approach had exemplified expense thinking, while our recovery had been built on investment thinking that considered all stakeholders and long-term sustainability. One particularly meaningful conversation was with Elena Rodriguez, CEO of a chemical manufacturing company in Texas, who was facing pressure from her board to reduce environmental compliance spending. "Jennifer, I know that cutting these programs would be a mistake, but I'm struggling to make the business case in terms that resonate with board members who are focused on quarterly results." I shared with Elena the framework we had developed for presenting investment thinking to financially focused audiences. The key was translating long-term benefits into present value calculations that demonstrated the financial wisdom of maintaining or increasing investments in areas like safety, quality, and compliance. We had created models that showed how the costs of regulatory violations, quality failures, and safety incidents could be quantified and compared to the investments required to prevent them. The framework also included risk assessment tools that helped board members understand the probability and potential magnitude of various negative outcomes. When Michael had proposed his budget cuts, he had focused only on the certain savings while ignoring the uncertain but potentially catastrophic costs. Our approach made both sides of the equation visible and quantifiable. Elena's situation reminded me of my own experience before being terminated, when I had tried to explain to Michael why his proposed cuts were financially dangerous. The difference was that I now had the credibility that came from having been proven right, along with a comprehensive methodology for presenting complex risk analyses in accessible terms. The success of my keynote presentation led to additional speaking opportunities and consulting requests that had become an increasingly important part of my professional identity. The Harvard Business School had invited me to teach an executive education course on strategic cost management in regulated industries, which provided an opportunity to influence the next generation of business leaders. The course curriculum was built around the central premise that effective cost management required deep understanding of industry-specific requirements and stakeholder impacts. Students worked through case studies based on real situations, including our own experience at Midwest Manufacturing, to develop skills in comprehensive financial analysis that considered all relevant factors rather than focusing solely on immediate cash impacts. One of the most rewarding aspects of teaching was seeing students grasp the concept that ethical leadership and financial performance were not just compatible, but mutually reinforcing. Many arrived with the assumption that profitability required compromising on values or cutting corners on safety and quality. Through detailed analysis of companies that had achieved sustained success through responsible practices, they learned that the opposite was typically true. The research component of my academic involvement had led to collaboration with business school faculty on studies of leadership decision-making in crisis situations. Our published paper, "When Doing Right Pays Dividends: A Longitudinal Study of Ethical Leadership and Financial Performance," had been cited extensively in both academic and practitioner publications. The research had confirmed what our experience had suggested. Companies that maintained high ethical standards during financial pressure often outperformed those that compromised values for short-term gains. The data showed that responsible cost management practices led to more sustainable profitability, lower regulatory and legal costs, better employee retention, and stronger customer loyalty. Back at Midwest Manufacturing, the success of our transformation had created new challenges and opportunities that required continued evolution of our leadership approach. The recognition we had received had attracted attention from potential acquisition partners, requiring careful consideration of how to maintain our values-based culture while exploring growth opportunities. Several private equity firms had approached us with acquisition offers that valued the company at multiples significantly higher than industry norms. The premium valuations reflected recognition that our operational excellence and ethical reputation represented competitive advantages that translated into financial value. However, I was determined to ensure that any partnership would support, rather than undermine, the culture and practices that had driven our success. The due diligence process with potential partners had become an opportunity to articulate and document the leadership principles that had guided our recovery. We had developed what we called the Midwest Way, a comprehensive framework for decision-making that balanced stakeholder interests and long-term sustainability with financial performance. The Midwest Way included specific protocols for evaluating proposed changes to ensure they aligned with our core values while advancing business objectives. Any cost reduction proposal had to demonstrate not just immediate savings, but also analysis of potential impacts on safety, quality, employee engagement, customer satisfaction, and regulatory compliance. This comprehensive approach to change management had prevented the kind of mistakes Michael had made while enabling continuous improvement and adaptation. The employee ownership program we had implemented had been another innovation that reflected our commitment to sharing the benefits of success with those who had contributed to it. Rather than concentrating wealth gains among senior executives and external investors, we had created mechanisms for all employees to participate in the company's improved performance. The ownership program had multiple components, including profit sharing based on company-wide performance metrics, equity participation for longer-tenured employees, and performance bonuses tied to safety, quality, and efficiency improvements. The financial impact had been substantial, with many employees seeing their annual compensation increase by 20 to 30% as the company's performance improved. More importantly, the ownership mentality that had emerged from this program had reinforced the collaborative culture that was central to our success. Employees thought like owners because they were owners, taking personal responsibility for outcomes and looking for ways to contribute beyond their immediate job responsibilities. The succession planning process we had initiated reflected our commitment to sustainable leadership development rather than dependence on individual executives. Having experienced the disruption that could result from leadership changes, we had invested heavily in developing internal talent and creating systems that could maintain performance regardless of personnel changes. The leadership development program we had created identified high-potential employees throughout the organization and provided them with opportunities to develop both technical skills and leadership capabilities. The program included cross-functional assignments, mentoring relationships with senior executives, external education opportunities, and leadership of special projects that contributed to company objectives. Several of the program participants had already been promoted to senior roles, bringing fresh perspectives while maintaining continuity with our core values and practices. Sarah Chen had been promoted to Vice President of Operations, Tom Rodriguez had become Director of Organizational Excellence, and Brandon Walsh had advanced to Chief Financial Officer, demonstrating that people could grow and contribute when given appropriate support and development opportunities. The community impact of our transformation had extended far beyond our company boundaries, contributing to economic development and social progress in ways that reinforced our commitment to stakeholder capitalism. Our improved performance had enabled expansion of local operations, creating hundreds of new jobs in manufacturing, engineering, and support functions. The partnerships we had developed with local educational institutions had created pathways for students to gain practical experience while contributing to our operations. The internship and co-op programs we sponsored had become models for industry-academia collaboration, with several other companies adopting similar approaches to workforce development. The supplier development program we had initiated had helped dozens of local businesses improve their capabilities and expand their market opportunities. Rather than simply demanding lower prices from vendors, we had worked collaboratively to identify efficiency improvements and quality enhancements that benefited both parties. This approach had created a network of suppliers who were invested in our success and committed to continuous improvement. The environmental sustainability initiatives we had implemented had demonstrated that responsible environmental practices could enhance rather than hinder operational efficiency. The energy efficiency improvements we had made had reduced both environmental impact and operating costs. The waste reduction programs we had developed had eliminated disposal costs while creating new revenue streams from recycled materials. The industry recognition we had received for these environmental efforts had enhanced our reputation and opened new market opportunities. Several customers had specifically chosen to work with us because of our environmental leadership. while others had asked us to help them improve their own sustainability practices. The regulatory agencies that had once viewed us with suspicion during Michael's tenure now cited our programs as examples for other companies to follow. The collaborative relationships we had built with OSHA, EPA, and other agencies had created opportunities to influence regulatory development and industry standards in ways that benefited all stakeholders. As I reflected on the journey from termination to transformation, I was struck by how the experience had changed not just my career trajectory, but my fundamental understanding of leadership and success. The woman who had been fired for questioning dangerous budget cuts had discovered that principled leadership could create value in ways that purely financial approaches never could. The personal growth I had experienced throughout this process had been as significant as the professional achievements. The confidence that came from being proven right after taking a principled stand had made me a more effective advocate for responsible practices. The credibility earned through successful transformation had provided platforms to influence broader industry practices and leadership development. The relationships I had built throughout this journey had become one of its most valuable outcomes. The network of ethical leaders, innovative thinkers, and committed professionals that had emerged from our experience was contributing to positive change throughout the manufacturing sector and beyond. Patricia Williams continued to serve as a mentor and advisor, but our relationship had evolved into a true partnership focused on advancing responsible leadership practices. Her wisdom and experience complemented my energy and innovation in ways that benefited both our companies and the broader business community. The junior executives I had mentored had grown into confident leaders who were applying the lessons learned from our transformation in their own organizations. Several had been recruited to senior positions at other companies, where they were implementing similar approaches to stakeholder-focused leadership and comprehensive decision-making. The speaking and consulting opportunities that had emerged from our experience had provided platforms to share lessons learned with audiences throughout the business world. The common thread in all these engagements was the message that ethical leadership and financial performance were not just compatible, but mutually reinforcing when implemented thoughtfully and consistently. The book I was writing about our experience would be published next year by a major business publisher, providing another vehicle for sharing the insights gained from being terminated for doing the right thing and ultimately being vindicated by the results. The working title was The Cost of Cutting Costs: How Principled Leadership Drives Sustainable Success, and early feedback from reviewers had been extremely positive. The academic research I was contributing to had the potential for even broader impact, influencing how business schools taught leadership and decision-making to future executives. The case studies being developed from our experience would help students understand that the most important leadership decisions often involved saying no to apparently attractive short-term opportunities in order to protect long-term value creation. Looking toward the future, I felt optimistic about the continued evolution of business leadership toward more stakeholder-focused and values-driven approaches. The success we had achieved at Midwest Manufacturing was being replicated by other companies that were discovering the competitive advantages of responsible practices. The next generation of business leaders appeared to be more receptive to comprehensive approaches to success that considered all stakeholders rather than focusing solely on shareholder returns. The employees, customers, suppliers, and communities that had once been viewed as constraints on profit maximization were increasingly recognized as sources of sustainable competitive advantage. The technology developments that were transforming manufacturing were creating new opportunities to achieve both efficiency and responsibility simultaneously. The data analytics capabilities that were becoming available enabled more sophisticated understanding of the relationships between operational practices and financial outcomes, making it easier to demonstrate the business case for ethical leadership. As I prepared to leave the convention center after my keynote presentation, I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Amanda Chen, a recent MBA graduate who had just been hired as a financial analyst at a manufacturing company in Ohio. Her question captured the essence of what I hoped would be my lasting contribution to business leadership. Ms. Martinez, your story gives me hope that I can build a career based on doing the right thing rather than just following orders. But I'm nervous about speaking up when I see problems, especially as someone just starting out. How do you find the courage to challenge authority when you know it might cost you your job? I smiled, remembering my own uncertainty as a young professional trying to navigate the complex dynamics of corporate life. Amanda, the courage to do the right thing comes from understanding that your professional reputation and personal integrity are your most valuable assets. They're worth protecting even when doing so involves short-term risks. I continued, but courage without competence isn't enough. You need to develop the skills to analyze complex situations, document your concerns thoroughly, and present alternatives that advance organizational objectives while addressing the problems you've identified. The goal isn't to be right, it's to help your organization succeed in sustainable and responsible ways. As Amanda walked away with a thoughtful expression, I realized that her question had reminded me why the story of being terminated for questioning budget cuts remained relevant and important. It wasn't just about vindication or personal success. It was about demonstrating that principled leadership was possible and profitable in the real world of competitive business. The shocking audit results that had revealed the flaws in Michael's approach had done more than prove my concerns were valid. They had shown that organizations could achieve extraordinary success when guided by leaders who understood that true strength came from integrity, expertise, and commitment to all stakeholders rather than just shareholders. The transformation that had followed had proven that the choice between doing well and doing good was often a false choice created by short-term thinking and incomplete analysis. When leaders took the time to understand the full implications of their decisions and considered all relevant stakeholders, they typically discovered that ethical practices and financial success were not just compatible, but mutually reinforcing. As I drove home that evening, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point, and excited about the opportunities ahead to continue demonstrating that principled leadership was not just a moral imperative, but a practical pathway to sustainable success. The woman who had been fired for asking hard questions had become someone whose answers were sought by leaders throughout the business world. The story would continue to evolve, but its central message would remain constant. Sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is stand up for what's right, even when doing so involves personal risk. The courage to take that stand, combined with the competence to offer better alternatives, could transform not just individual careers, but entire organizations and industries. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.